Our topic today is what is a trusted news source? And following today's talk, my colleague Rebecca Foos will be in the back of the room to guide everyone to a short overview with Brian Donito, who will give you some information on some of the many trusted resources available to library patrons at the main information desk. Our guest speaker today is Tom Prietti, resident scholar in media at St. John Fisher College, where he founded the Communications and Journalism program, and Professor Emeritus of Communication at Monroe Community College, where he taught for 27 years and served as chair of the Communications Department. Tom was also a founding member of the Little Theater Film Society and past president of its board, a regular commentator on media issues on WXXI AM's 1370 Connection, and he has also been a volunteer with several local organizations, including the Rochester Ad Council and the Friends of the Rochester Public Library. Media literacy is one of Tom's personal passions in life, and it is an absolute privilege to bring him to our podium today. Please join me in welcoming Tom Prietti.
Good afternoon. I have a 14-year-old granddaughter who constantly is measuring my success in the world. And I'm constantly threatening to leave her out of the will. So it's an ongoing battle. And I said to her a couple days ago, I said, I'm speaking at the Rochester Public Library on Tuesday. And I said, Tuesday night I'm speaking at St. John Fisher College. And she said, the real test will be, she said, I know the students at Fisher, they have to go. Somebody's requiring it and they have to write a paper about it. She said the real test will be this. I forgot my phone. I wanted to take a picture of this crowd. So my wife is going to take a photograph of the crowd, and I think Ned's taking photographs as well. It's a real pleasure to be here. This is the question of, well, first I think Susan and I discussed this. What is a trusted news source? I think is euphemistic for fake news. You know, what is fake news? And I would have to say almost all news is fake news. All news. Start with that premise and you'll be well served the rest of your life. Every class that I ever taught at St. John Fisher, at Monroe Community College, I taught at SUNY Brockport, I taught a class once at Nazareth, once at RIT. I don't think I taught at Roberts Wesleyan. They didn't let me in. They didn't want me there. But almost every class I started with the Aristotelian model of communication. Now, Aristotle was born, I think, in 324 AD. I never heard his name until I was a sophomore in college. I have to admit, honestly, I had no idea who he was. And one day I mentioned to my Sicilian grandfather that I was studying Aristotle and Plato, and he said they lived in Sicily. So for years, I thought Aristotle and Plato lived in Sicily. It turns out he was half right, but it shows you can't trust all news sources. Plato lived most of his life in the place we call today Siracusa, in Sicily. And again, most people don't know that because what do we call Plato? A Greek philosopher. He was not. He was a Sicilian philosopher, and he did most of his important work there. But Aristotle, I mean, here we're talking 2,400 years ago. Aristotle actually came up with a model where he sat in a room and thought about how does human communication take place? And he actually created a little drawing that had an S for the sender, in this case, I'm the sender, and an R for the receiver. And he said the sender encapsulates something, puts it in some kind of medium, slides across, and the receiver decides to pick from that medium. Now, I'm kind of giving him probably a lot more credit than is deserved. We've had several centuries now to evaluate how good that model is, but it still works. And every class I ever started with, I said, here's the S, that's me. Here's the R, that's you. And then a few other people along the way. In fact, a real quick story. My junior year in college, I had to take a social science class. And the only class available at a time that I was, at that time, a chemistry major. So my schedule was blocked completely with labs all over the place. Finding the unknown, if you've ever taken a chemistry class. That's what I was doing. So the only class that fit my schedule was anthropological linguistics with a guy who's still my hero, Julian Granberry. He's 90 years old. He lives in Horseshoe Beach, Florida, and he's an absolute genius. He speaks 256 languages fluently, and he's the holder of many, many awards having to do with linguistic analysis, and he's just brilliant. But here I am, the chemistry major, English major, philosophy major, sitting in a class with a group of anthropological linguistics, because the 9 other people in the room were all anthropology majors. And I had no idea what I was going to do there. I was just picking up social science credit. And I have to tell you, that class changed my life. Because one of the first things that Julian Granberry said in class, and he never brought notes, which flabbergasted me, he walked in, he got to know, he used to call us by our first names within the second class. He knew every person in the class, but it was a small class. But he was especially interested in me. He wanted to know, what was I doing there? Now, how do you tell the professor it was the only class that fit? You know, it's like, I came to your store because it's the only one open. You know, it's like shopping in the old Soviet Union. You know, what choice do you have? Turned out to be one of the most important classes I ever took, because Julian showed us the sender to receiver model. And then he added one other major thing to the communication process, and he said, remember, all communication is purposive. It's the purposive transfer of information. And by the time I got to know Julian a little bit, I started taking every word that he said as being just incredibly important. I don't know if it was true or not true, but it was just important. If Julian thought it and said it, articulated it, I had to think about it. And I would constantly spend some time trying to figure out, is there ever any communication that's not purposive, in which we're not trying to do something to someone else? And I can't think of one. I really cannot. Now, you could probably say, well, if I sat in the woods alone and nobody else could hear me, and, you know, it's like that philosophy conundrum about if a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it. But even if I sit somewhere and let out sound of some sort, I'm communicating something. In a case like this, what am I trying to do to you? I'd like to think I'm trying to inform. Julian used to say, inform, that's just a fuzzword for persuade. We're always trying to persuade people. We always think we're the smartest person in the room and we want you to come over to our side. So the communication model, he took Aristotle's communication model, sender to the receiver, encapsulating some kind of message, and that it had to be purposive. He said that's one of the differences between us and animals. All human communication is purposive. Not all animal communication, from what we can tell, is purposive. And I'll let you think about that one. I'm not going to get into that one. One of the other things that I learned really quickly from Julian Granberry and from Aristotle, and it was the first time I sat in a newsroom, it was the concept of the gatekeeper. And the gatekeeper may be the single most important thing when we talk about credible news sources that most of us pay absolutely no attention to. So if you sit and you're watching Don Alhart or Maureen Maguire, or I don't know who's on Channel 10 anymore. That seems to be changing like crazy. But if you're watching Lester Holt, by the way, granddaughter Elizabeth said the only person who makes more sense than I do in about talking about local news is Lester Holt. And I'd have to agree with her, at least that Lester Holt is first. I don't know where I fit. I'm way down the pack. But I'm constantly thinking about it. Back to the concept of purposive communication and gatekeepers. Anyone know what a gatekeeper is? Right now, I'm a gatekeeper. Susan was a gatekeeper when she made out the schedule. When you found your parking spot, you were your gatekeeper. But in essence, the parking spot was the gatekeeper. The parking spot kind of called you in. Every single day when we consume any bits of information, we should try to figure out why somebody decided that this is important. Most of us do not. Most of us are sponges. And most of us sit there, kind of take it in, and not think about what's really going on. I spent one summer in 1980. I was leaving teaching at St. John Fisher College to go become the vice president of marketing at Time Warner, right up the street from here. And at that time, we were over on Gorham Street. And one of the first things I did was I said, I'm going to be 9 months without a job. I wasn't going to start at Time Warner for a little period of time. And I had gotten to know, well, I knew a whole bunch of folks at Channel 13. One of them was a guy named Mike Power. Some of you probably remember Mike, great reporter for the Times-Union. Is Mike here? I'm surprised he's not here, because Mike would usually show up at one of my things and throw darts. One of the smartest guys in the room, too. But one of the things that happened to me was Mike hired me to be his assistant news producer for the 6 o'clock news. And I spent a couple months there. And I learned so much about the news business. It was staggering, because the news business had changed so much from 1967 to 1980. And I got to watch some really super pros trying to deliver solid information every single day. In fact, very soon I became part of the process. But one of the things that kept taunting me, and Julian Granberry, by the way, my professor, was still teaching at St. John Fisher, and he said, when you put together a newscast, he would ask me, when you put together a newscast, what are you trying to do? I said, inform the public? And he said, oh, garbage. And I said, you want me to say persuade? He goes, oh, absolutely persuade. That's what you're doing. And I said, what do you mean I'm trying to persuade? He said, so you told me you're part of the process. You and Mike Power sit every day and decide what news story's first, what news story's second, what news story's third. And also I realized every single day there were 20 news stories that were worthy of coverage, and we usually only picked 3 or 4. So what happened to those other 16 or 17? Disappeared. And 2 people were making decisions on what was newsworthy. And frequently we made decisions on what was newsworthy by where the closest car was that we could send a reporter. Something in the news business we call proximity. In a newsroom, you used to hear that all the time. And in a couple minutes, I'll explain why that has changed. Because in the process of trying to find a trusted news source, you have to do some work. So we actually would sit in a newsroom. And when I realized I was a major gatekeeper, because I was working at Channel 13, 1980, and we had just become #1 in the ratings. And I thought, boy, I'm performing one of the most significant functions of the news media. I'm setting the agenda. And one of the most important things that news media and all media do, not just news, we could concentrate on news, but one of the most important things all media do is set our agenda. And what I mean by set our agenda, they tell us what to talk about. And they tell us what, by omission, what not to talk about. Anyone here listen to Democracy Now? Strongly recommend. I see Ned's hand go up in there and someone else. Democracy Now! Runs counter to every single portion of that possibility. And what they do is they go cover news stories that have been forgotten. Every once in a while, I think City Newspaper does this once a year. What are the top 10 news stories in Rochester that weren't covered this past year? Almost every year, it's the same news story. Anyone know what it is? Juan, did you say something? Poverty, by far. We don't cover poverty. Doesn't take a genius to drive through Rochester to realize that this is a place ravaged by poverty. So if we're not covering that story, are you going to trust the sources that talk about it? Well, of course you are, to a certain extent. And what I want to get across today is that there really are no single trusted news sources. None. Not one. And I'm sure there are probably a whole group of XXI and NPR listeners in here like me. I wake up in the morning, I walk over to Alexa, and Alexa speaks now before I do and says, do you want to listen to WXXI again? And is it going to stream all day? Am I going to get a break? Do you serve water? I listen to NPR. And sometimes I'm furious. Because if you listen to any single newscast on NPR, and I think they are the most trusted news source in America, absolutely. But they're flawed, no differently than I'm flawed. And what does NPR do wrong? They cover the United States as if all of the United States is New York City and Washington. and they have forgotten the rest of the nation. You know, the flyover states, the people that voted Donald Trump into office, and they got their revenge. And NPR makes that mistake every single day. Just listen to the first news story. I just listened to the first news story that came across with Corva Coleman at 11 o'clock had to do with a Muslim extremist. What the hell is that? I don't know what a Muslim, I have to be honest with you, I don't know what a Muslim extremist. And all I know is one person's extremist is another person's normal human being, and maybe a hero. I don't know. And I'm thinking, wait a second, I think the number one news story today might be what's happening to the stock market. But that was second. I hear constantly over and over again, I don't mean to be callous or cruel, from NPR, that there was an explosion in Afghanistan today that killed 12 people. I can never lessen the importance of that. My heart goes out to them. The question I would have, and I have constantly, is what the hell are we still doing there? What are we doing? That's since 2003, and 2001 actually, and we're still there? And my most trusted news source doesn't ever ask that question? And in fact, what they do is they accept the line. Now, it looks like there are a few people in here old enough to remember the Vietnam War and that coverage. Do you remember how they lied? And do you remember how much we trusted Walter Cronkite? And for 9 years, Walter Cronkite spewed the line. He said exactly what the Pentagon said. We even believed the body counts. The body counts were garbage. But we bought in. And why do we buy in? And we're probably all sitting here going, well, wait a second, I didn't buy in, but my dumb neighbor did. Or all those, all those ignorami who inhabit my family, they all bought in. Well, we all buy in to a certain extent. And sometimes just by showing up, we buy in. But the other side of that is sometimes by not showing up, we buy in. So how do you fix that? There are no easy fixes other than hard work. How do you find a trusted news source? When Susan first gave me this topic, the first thing that jumped out at me was the concept of credibility. Who do you trust? Who do you believe? I'm sure by now we're about 15 minutes into this, and probably 80% of the room doesn't believe half of what I'm saying. And there are probably several of you who would want to take me outside and perform a cold crucifixion right in front of the building today. And with good reason, because I have my own little slant on the world. One of the other things I learned as I was teaching a course called interpersonal communication, which should be required of every human being, not just every American. And it should be taught from the time the child can speak. And when I say human communication, it's understanding relationships, trying to figure out how can we get along as best as possible. We don't have to agree, but how can we be at least agreeable? How can we do that? But we don't teach that. We've left it behind. We've decided reading is the number one skill that should be taught to American children. Mistake number one. It's not just reading. We need a whole bunch of other literacies taught exactly at the same time, embedded into curriculum, to help us understand that that act of credibility on our part is a really difficult leap. And that when we make the leap, probably 90% of the time, maybe 95% of the time, leaping to the other side, we miss. And then we leave ourselves injured. We're on the ground. We're groping and trying to find out what's really true. I don't know. I don't have any answers. I have a lot of questions. And I think that's one of the things I did best with my students. So on a regular basis, I would have my students take that Aristotelian model of sender to receiver, which looks so simple, and try to analyze it. Spend 24 hours. They would have to keep a little journal and spend the next 24 hours going around school, talking to each other, and then write down a little diagram of what just happened. And you know what happens when we start thinking about our interactions? It's amazing, and it's fun, and it's wonderful, and it's terrifying, and it should be. So again, one of the things you might want to do, if you have DVR at home, watch Lester Holt tonight. Listen for the first sentence and freeze it. And say, what did he just say? And how did that news story become number one? Because what can you trust? Do you watch Lester Holt? How many of you here are NBC News fans? Anyone? Quite a few, yeah. By the way, he is the most trusted person in America today, which is, that's a pretty easy thing to accomplish in 2007. I won't say much else than that. But watch the PBS NewsHour. My wife and I were vigilant watchers of the PBS NewsHour. Judy Woodruff, who is somebody I met years ago, and I have nothing but the greatest respect and admiration for her. But I'm suspicious. I'm really suspicious when she brings guests on, because almost all the guests come from Washington, and they're almost always white men. And that's not my world. My world is really different than that. And then I start thinking about when she puts up there, this is Norman Orenstein from the Institute. He's got an axe to grind. He's got a job to keep. And what if he told the truth? And maybe he does. I don't know what the truth is. I'm really not sure what the truth is. It's not an easy thing to discover. So back to the gatekeepers. One of the most fun things I ever had in my life. And I realized that I was not just a gatekeeper in a newsroom. As soon as I became a gatekeeper in a newsroom, I realized, my goodness, in a classroom, I'm a gatekeeper. I tell them what we're going to cover, and I really kind of tell them what they're going to think. And that's terrifying. I used to come home and tell my wife, I'd say, every time I go to a class, and I spent 45 years college teaching, and it was mostly by accident. A guy named Charles J. Lavery hired me at St. John Fisher College. And I used to look at him and say, are you sure you want me here? I said, we have 37 members of the faculty in 1968. 30 of them were priests. 7 of them were former seminarians. And me, a kid who went to Franklin High School who dropped F-bombs on a regular basis. And I used to look at him and he'd look at me and he'd say, you're exactly what we need. He said, you're going to have to help me make St. John Fisher College cool. And I used to try to analyze that. I'd say, St. John Fisher College, cool. Are you kidding? 1968, does anyone remember what St. John Fisher College was? It was you do. Did you work there?
I was up the road
at Nazareth. Okay, so that was the female version of St. John Fisher. Yeah. St. John Fisher College was 600 males, most of whom graduated from Aquinas and McQuaid, who didn't have high enough SAT scores or enough resources to go to another college, and who could drive to school wearing ties and sport coats. That was St. John Fisher College. And I used to listen to my colleagues spew their information. I spewed information too, because part of the job I figured was I had to have as many note cards as possible so I could be smart. But once I started, what a liberating thing it is that you realize when you're a college professor and you realize, oh my God, this is like the ultimate form of mind control. So I would tell my wife, I'd say, you know what I do now when I walk to the door of every classroom? Before I open the door, I look up. I don't believe in any deities, but I look up and I say, I don't know who made this possible. And I don't know why you trust me, but I could never think of a cooler gig in the world than to walk in here and talk. And yes, I taught mass communication, which really it's not a science. It's more a craft than anything else. And it changes every single day. I was in a field, I have been in a field all my life. That changes every single day. So how do you get truth out of something that's that fluid? It's quicksand. There have been some other landmarks along the way, and then I'm going to turn this over for questions, because I'm sure the questions and comments. I'm sure you folks know as much about this as I do. But some landmarks along the way. In 1988, a guy named Rush Limbaugh got signed by WHAM in Rochester. Now, a lot of you probably hold nothing but contempt for Rush Limbaugh. And I hold nothing but admiration for Rush Limbaugh. Because one of the things that Rush Limbaugh did for America is he brought a voice in that had to be heard. Because if you knew anything about the traditional media in the United States, and by traditional media, what comes into your brain? You know what jumps into my brain? Time Magazine, the Washington Post, the three major networks, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times. I mean, they're and the Associated Press and Reuters and the BBC. Those are like the traditional things. But if you go take a look at them in 1988, they were full of people who went mostly to the same colleges, who spoke most of the same language, and agreed on just about everything. And I think that was a really unhealthy period for us. I think we're in a much more uncomfortable but much more healthy period today, by far. And one of the reasons we've gotten there is, guess what? For the first time in history, the audience controls the process. We control the process of news. I hop on Twitter. The first thing I look at in the morning is Twitter. I don't look at the Democrat and Chronicle. If there's any DNC folks here, I don't apologize any longer. I don't. Newspapers, 2005, newspapers started moving in the wrong direction. And it's not their choice. It's not where they want to be. But the model of newspaper funding just doesn't work anymore. There aren't enough eyeballs, and the eyeballs that are there are not willing to pay enough money to keep it alive. Do you know what Craigslist did to the newspaper industry? The pure cash cow that's called classified advertising. Craig Newmark in San Francisco said, because he hated the San Francisco Chronicle, this computer genius said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to invent a free classified. Think about Craigslist today. 75% of the money that used to go to newspapers for classified advertising goes nowhere. It's now free. And I don't even look at the classified ads in the Democrat and Chronicle or any other newspaper. I mean, it doesn't. But I look at Craigslist every once in a while. Somebody's trying to break in. Fire exit. Go the other way. So think about the model of news information that we have in the United States. Also, think about why they're there. They're there to make money. That's a cash cow. And they're there to make money. Even XXI today is making money. I had to turn them off this morning because there were too many membership pitches. So what I say to Alexa, Alexa, play WRVO out of Oswego. And they're not doing pitches this week. And I love XXI. I just got my tax statement. XXI gets more money from me than my wife does. So I'm passionate about what they do, and I really admire. In fact, Juan Vasquez is here who, man, I look at your website every day and thank you. Put your hand up, because everybody should know how good you are. This guy is fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You know how many times I retweet you, and XXI gets it. And they don't appear to have a major axe to grind. And they're not there to make money. They're there to make our community better. So how do you find trusted news sources? You work. You have to work really hard at it. You have to question constantly. We are the only major industrialized nation in the world that does not teach media literacy. Think about that. We are it. We think we're the strongest, smartest, most powerful, most informed country in the world. We're not. And we keep falling down a little bit further, not just because of media literacy, because we also should be teaching financial literacy. I heard Uri Berliner this morning say it's fewer than 47% of Americans have any money in the stock market. That's a huge mistake. If you believe in America and if you want to set yourself up for the future, you should be financially literate. But most Americans have no idea where to turn for it. And where's your trusted news source? How do you get that information? All our lives we've been handed information from other people. Parents, teachers. I'm going to end with this last thing and then we're going to open it up. In 1965, I realized my dad and I had taken different turns. My dad was buying into the narrative of Vietnam. And I loved my dad. He was one of the smartest human beings I ever met in my life. And I wasn't buying it anymore. I was reading a guy named David Halberstam, who was telling me that not only were we wasting our time and money and lives over there, we were lying about it. We were lying about it every single day, and and his network, or his newspaper was parroting it. And I'll never forget the first time my dad and I disagreed about Vietnam. And he looked at me and he said, "One of us is right." And I said, "I'll leave it at that. One of us is right." And I hope we can get better and smarter. One other last thing. I became good friends with Marshall McLuhan, the great communication theorist. I won't tell you the story about how this happened, but one day Marshall said to me, as I was fixing something, he said to me, "How'd you learn how to do that?" And I said, "Because I can't afford to hire somebody to come and fix it. I don't make enough money to do that." And I figured the guy that came the first time and charged me $80 for it, I looked at him and I said, he could do it. I could probably do it. Might take me a little bit longer. And he looked at me and he goes, he said, "You learned one of the greatest lessons in life. In breakdown, there's breakthrough." Today in America, we are breaking down and we are breaking through as well. I can guarantee you this will be a better country for what happened with the election of Donald Trump. And I didn't want to say his name, but I had to say it. So let's open it up for questions and comments.